Flashback. It's 2007. Thomas wishes.
The Doctor and his soon-to-be new companion, Martha Jones, gaze out across the lunar surface from the balcony of the Royal Hope Hospital, Martha's place of work, which has been temporarily abducted from Earth by an intergalactic police force so they can locate an alien fugitive hiding within. Awestruck by her extraordinary circumstances, Martha reflects on other extraterrestrial activity that has recently impacted humanity, and, on a personal level, how she had lost her cousin Adeola during the Battle of Canary Wharf. The Doctor solemnly consoles her, aloofly admitting that he was at the battle, but what Martha doesn't know is that the Doctor was directly involved in her cousin's fate. Adeola, an employee at Canary Wharf's Torchwood base, had been taken control of by the infiltrating Cyberman advance guard, and with no way of reversing her conversion, the Doctor definitively ended her life. With this context, the Doctor's condolences subtly double as an apology for what he did, but Martha would never know that. It's a nice understated moment, performed so well by both Adjaman and Tennant, which helps to set the tone for what a complicated relationship these two characters would go on to have.
Good scene. Cut. Print. So, could this have been expanded on?
To my knowledge, there is one novella, penned by Terrance Dicks, that briefly touches on this topic again in a relatively similar fashion, but in terms of the TV show, neither Adeola nor how her loss affected Martha and her family come up again. Not that it needed to, mind you. Series 3 has no shortage of compelling character drama as is anyway, and there is merit to this restrained, one-and-done poignant mention in Martha's debut. But hypothetically, was there more that could have been mined out of this?
How did we end up with Adeola and Martha anyway?
Okay, so Freema Agyeman auditioned to play a couple of bit parts in Series 2, ultimately securing the role of Adeola in the two-part finale Army of Ghosts, with her character meeting the terrible fate that I laid out for you earlier. However, the range that Freema demonstrated in her auditions impressed Russell T Davies and his entourage so much that they kept her in mind as they continued to sketch out a new companion for Series 3. With her on-set performance and demeanour only sweetening the deal for the higher-ups, they would invite her to come in for another audition alongside David Tennant for the role of Martha, and, well, the rest is history. With that, Freema's prior role as Adeola was given a cute nod in Martha's debut, and they swiftly moved on.
Now, Freema or no Freema, Russell obviously had plans for where he wanted to take Martha in the aftermath of the Doctor and Rose's relationship, which is fair enough. The rebound arc isn't for everyone, but I respect it artistically.
However, connecting Martha to Adeola does make for curious circumstances, depending on the closeness of their relation. Say if they'd been sisters or twins, then it would have been storytelling malpractice to not tackle that loss more directly and bake it into the core of Martha's personality, as well as her bond with the Doctor, given that he did have a role to play, which would ultimately shift her character's trajectory and interfere with the vision of the series they were mapping out. So practically speaking, settling on cousins was a smart move. That's a relation close enough for her absence to lend a sense of pathos to Martha, but also distant enough for it to not necessarily weigh so heavily on her psyche that it distracts from the arc the writers wanted to take her on.
However, what if they instead decided to embrace this familial connection as a proper character arc for Series 3? Could it have worked?
I mean, what a concept. A companion coping with the absence of a missing, presumed dead close relative, only to find out later that this amazing time traveller they've bonded with not only knows what happened to them, but was even implicated? That's a juicy idea, ripe with emotional potential. And in some ways, it could even complement the series we actually got. Martha's mother Francine, for example, strongly disapproves of the Doctor, especially after the Lazarus experiment when she's told damning things about him by an informant of Mr. Saxon. But walk with me here, what if one of the things she was told concerned what happened at Canary Wharf? I'm sure the esteemed Mr. Saxon could get his hands on that information one way or another. This would only help to intensify Francine's protectiveness of Martha. She now not only knows that this Doctor character is dangerous, but that he was even entangled in the death of a family member, which only makes him an even greater threat to his daughter's safety in her eyes and would add more weight to her decision decision to cooperate with Saxon's government. Hell, depending on the closeness of Adeola's relation, you could even tie her loss directly into being a contributing factor of Martha's broken family. It doesn't necessarily have to be the root cause, but a significant element perhaps.
Just spitballing here.
Additionally, on Martha's end, I can envision a situation akin to the opening of Gridlock, where she's eager to see the Doctor's home planet, but he shrugs the suggestion off and lies to her because he's emotionally reluctant to admit the truth. Now imagine a similar scenario, but substitute Gallifrey for Adeola. Martha can now travel anywhere in time and space, and she has a lost relative. Naturally, it could cross her mind that she can theoretically go back and find out what happened to her. Maybe even save her and bring her home, but the Doctor, wanting to protect her feelings, talks her out of it, maybe evoking his Time War angst to suggest that sometimes it's better not knowing these things. It doesn't necessarily have to be the premise of an entire episode, but perhaps some complementary flavour to already existing ones, like how in 42, when Martha believes she's about to die in the Taraji system and contemplates that, from her family's perspective, she'll have just disappeared and they'll never know what happened to her. Boom, perfect opportunity to evoke a parallel there. And of course, when Martha does find out about what happened to Adeola, maybe the Master could tell her to humiliate the Doctor, who caves in and admits it, I don't know. It could even be one of the reasons why she ultimately chooses to leave the Doctor by series end. Again, doesn't have to be the only one, it could theoretically coexist with what we got in the finished product. She could even be understanding of the position he was in, but also admit that things are just no longer the same between them, only further enforcing her family's welfare in her decision to leave.
On top of all this, I dare say a more fleshed out follow-up to Adeola's death like this could fit pretty well into the wider approach of the original Russell T Davies era.
After all, Russell made a point of being very considerate about the long-term consequences of our lead character's actions. There is a through line of cause and effect rippling out from the 10th Doctor's debut where he deposes Harriet Jones, which builds all the way through to the circumstances which seal his fate in his swan song. That's not to mention Ten and Rose causing their own separation because of their behaviour in Tooth and Claw, as Queen Victoria created Torchwood partially in response to their cavalier attitude, who would go on to interfere in things they don't understand, and, well, here we are. With all that being said, I think an arc building on what happened to Adeola would be a natural fit here. Hell, without Torchwood's existence, she wouldn't have even died in the first place.
It's food for thought. Yeah, I forgot to film this sentence with the rest the other day.
Now, a downside I can think of with this hypothetical concerns the lingering shadow of Rose on the show. There could have been a way of threading the needle, I suppose, but simultaneously juggling both Martha's missing relative, who the Doctor knows more about than he's letting on, and the Doctor's underestimation of Martha because he's still hung up over Rose, that could have potentially made their relationship so overcomplicated that you'd struggle to understand why Martha would even remain on good terms with him once all was said and done. And, well, the 10th Doctor already gets enough backlash as is for his on-screen treatment of Martha. He'd be nothing short of mega cancelled by Standom in this version of events. That and Rose herself already had her own emotional arc concerning a lost relative that was made more complicated by travelling with the Doctor. Completely different circumstances, sure, but it is worth noting. I'm not one to criticise repetition in Doctor Who, but Martha not having that baggage does make her more distinct as the successor to Rose. Lastly, and arguably most importantly, there's actually an ambiguity to the balcony scene that I've neglected to mention. I went into this analysis with the presumption that the Doctor does remember Adeola being at Canary Wharf, something more concretely confirmed in that Terence Dicks book I mentioned earlier. But what if he doesn't? He's the Doctor after all. He can only retain so many faces across his myriad of travels, and he's suffered his own loss which would come to dominate his memory of that day. So yeah, you could be like me and read his melancholic response to Martha as being guilt over Adeola, but you could also read it as him internally relating to Martha's hurt with his own, so caught up in his angst that he doesn't even realise his own role in hers. Kinda like their dynamic for the rest of the series. And would it really be the right thing to neuter that interpretation for the sake sake of an alternative. So yeah, in some ways, not expanding Adeola into an arc of persistent grief was for the best.
Though I suppose, as a point of comparison, the broad skeleton of what I'm suggesting here did end up happening a couple of years later in the Big Finish audio dramas.
Let me break it down. The 8th Doctor and companion Lucy Miller end up meeting and befriending the latter's Auntie Pat before Lucy's own birth, and Lucy's shocked to learn that Auntie Pat has a husband who she never knew about. Well, it turns out this husband is a Zygon fugitive, and when members of his own species catch up with him, Auntie Pat ends up dying in the crossfire. As a tribute to her, Pat's Zygon lover assumes her form, as well as the role Auntie Pat would have played in Lucy's childhood. The point is, the Doctor knows about this, but deliberately doesn't tell Lucy to protect her feelings, adding a layer of emotional complexity to this already somewhat unconventional friendship. And Lucy does end up finding out, in what is one of the most numb and downbeat Doctor Who stories ever made, and ultimately chooses to leave him. Sort of, but also yes, because her trust in him is broken. And it's beautiful, one of the most heartfelt emotional beats in really any Doctor Who media.
So yeah, a premise like this can and did end up working out in some form.
Now, before I sign off, I want to be clear about something. The ultimate point of this video is not to declare that Series 3 definitely should have done this, nor is it to say that Series 3 is wasted potential for passing it over, because I don't think that. The series we got is great. One of the revival's best, in fact. This is just a hypothetical. Could this have enhanced Series 3 further, as well as both Martha and the Doctor's characters?
What was versus what could have been. An enticing idea, especially for us Doctor Who fans. Right, take this. Because I'm not having you disappear. When that rings, you better come running, alright? I'll see you again, mister. Or Mrs. Or gender-neutral bestie.
Yeah, this isn't a leaving video. I'm not sure what that was about. But yeah, see you next time.